Midnight draped the small German village in a silence heavy with dread. The war had long since swallowed the horizon, but tonight it was finally here. A faint tremor rolled through the earth, the unmistakable growl of engines, closer with every passing minute. Inside a stone farmhouse, a mother blew out a candle, her hands trembling as she pulled her children into the cellar. Outside, the air smelled of damp soil and smoke. The church bell hung motionless, a black silhouette against a pale, restless sky. Then came the low clatter of metal. American tanks, their silhouettes emerging through the mist. Doors bolted. Windows went dark. No one knew if mercy or vengeance followed those stars on the steel hulls. Only the rhythmic thud of boots and the occasional barked order broke the tension. The long night of fear had reached its edge, and by dawn, nothing in this village or in Germany would ever be the same. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel. Like it, spread the word, and tell us where you're watching from. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich was disintegrating from within. The thunder that echoed across the German countryside was no longer a distant front. It was the sound of collapse. Allied bombers had reduced entire cities to ash. Rail lines lay twisted and silent, and the once unyielding Wehrmacht was retreating on every front. Food was scarce, fuel almost gone, and the promise of Hitler's final victory had become an empty echo repeated through crackling radios. Yet, inside the heart of Germany, the illusion of control persisted. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels filled the airwaves with frantic broadcasts, urging civilians to stand firm against Anglo-American terror. Posters warned of unspeakable horrors awaiting anyone who surrendered. According to the regime's lies, American soldiers would burn villages, slaughter children, and enslave women. Fear became a weapon more powerful than any artillery. But even the most loyal party members could see the truth in the sky. Every day, formations of silver-winged bombers darkened the clouds above. At night, the glow of distant fires painted the horizon red. Millions of civilians fled eastward, only to find themselves trapped between two approaching storms. The Red Army from one side, the Americans and British from the other. Inside German villages, life narrowed to survival. Farmers buried family heirlooms in their gardens. Mothers packed suitcases with bread, photographs, and silence. Schools closed. Churches filled with whispered prayers. In small towns across Bavaria, Hesse, and Thuringia, women took charge of households as fathers and sons vanished to the front or into the frozen soil of the Ardennes. The once proud German order was dissolving into exhaustion and disbelief. In the corridors of the Reich Chancellery, Hitler refused to accept reality. His maps still showed phantom divisions that no longer existed, his voice trembling with delusion as he demanded counterattacks from armies that were already gone. Meanwhile, Gestapo patrols roamed villages searching for defeatists. A careless word could lead to execution. The people lived between two terrors, the collapsing Reich above them and the unknown enemy advancing from beyond the hills. By February 1945, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine in several places. The Siegfried Line, once Germany's final defensive wall, cracked under relentless pressure. Entire towns surrendered without firing a shot, their inhabitants waving white sheets from shattered windows. The myth of invincibility had ended. German soldiers, many still in their teens, marched westward as prisoners, while others deserted in the night. The sound of tank treads had replaced the ticking of clocks. Still, Nazi propaganda clung to its narrative. Goebbels proclaimed that American soldiers were mongrel invaders who would destroy German civilization. Leaflets and loudspeakers promised death for traitors and despair for the weak. But in the privacy of their homes, women whispered another question. Would the Americans be as cruel as they had been told? In the spring of 1945, the front finally reached the heartland. From Aachen to Nuremberg, entire regions fell in weeks. Columns of refugees dragged carts piled with whatever life they could carry. Many villages saw the front approach not as thunderous battle, but as a slow suffocation. First, the distant guns, then the blackout orders, then the rumors that the Americans are only a few kilometers away. For countless civilians, especially women, this uncertainty was unbearable. They had seen what had happened in the East under Soviet occupation. Stories of revenge and violence carried by terrified refugees. Now, with the Western armies approaching, they feared the same fate. Some prepared white flags, others sharpened knives, not against the enemy, but for their own escape. When April 1945 arrived, the Reich's days were numbered. The radio played martial songs over dead air. The once proud swastika banners hung limp in the rain. Across the countryside, villagers listened for the first sounds of foreign boots. Would they face vengeance or mercy? No one could say. But every heartbeat of that final night carried the weight of a 12-year nightmare drawing to an end. And beyond those trembling villages, another army advanced. One disciplined, battle-hardened, and uncertain of what awaited it behind those darkened windows. For the soldiers of the United States Army, the road into Germany was both a march toward victory and a descent into the unknown. By March 1945, the Western Allies had crossed the Rhine at Remagen, a moment that symbolized the final breach of Hitler's fortress. But as American divisions pushed deeper into German soil, their mission changed from pure combat to something far more delicate: occupation, control, and the moral test of how to treat a defeated enemy. Most of the men entering Germany were veterans of France and Belgium, battle-hardened by the hedgerows of Normandy and the frozen agony of the Ardennes. They had seen comrades die in ambushes and towns reduced to rubble. To many, Germany was no longer a place. It was the cause of every wound, every grave. Yet their commanders knew that revenge could easily turn triumph into chaos. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, issued strict orders on conduct. Civilians were to be treated firmly but fairly. Looting, assault, or unnecessary violence were forbidden. The American soldier, he reminded them, represented not only a victorious army, but also a democratic ideal, an army of liberators, not conquerors. The U.S. Army's military government divisions, trained in civil administration, followed behind the combat troops to restore order, distribute food, and prevent reprisals. Still, discipline alone could not erase emotion. Every ruined town the Americans entered was filled with reminders of Nazi brutality: concentration camps, slave laborers, mass graves. When units like the 4th Armored, the 3rd Infantry, and the 45th Division passed through these horrors, their sense of restraint was tested to the limit. Commanders warned their men that they were entering a population saturated with Nazi propaganda. Every smile could hide a loyalist. Every house might contain a sniper. To many soldiers, the first encounters with German civilians were deeply unsettling. After years of fighting a faceless enemy, they found themselves staring at ordinary families: frightened women, hungry children, old men in torn coats. The reality clashed with everything they had been told. These were not monsters, but people crushed by the same war. In after-action reports, officers wrote of villages too quiet to be real, where white sheets hung from windows like ghosts. The rules of engagement were clear. Soldiers were not to harm civilians unless provoked. But confusion often ruled the night. German resistance groups, SS diehards, and scattered Volkssturm militias sometimes opened fire from houses or barns, prompting harsh retaliations. In such moments, mercy became difficult to separate from survival. Entire towns could be emptied overnight under suspicion of harboring snipers. Yet compared to the Eastern Front, the Western advance remained relatively restrained. American soldiers were also warned about another threat: their own image. Goebbels' propaganda had painted them as black devils and criminals without honor. The army understood that every action could confirm or break that myth. Psychological warfare teams distributed leaflets promising humane treatment for those who surrendered. Loudspeakers called out across rivers and valleys, "Lay down your arms, you will live." And remarkably, thousands did. As the front moved south toward Bavaria and east toward Thuringia, American patrols began entering smaller, untouched villages. These were not strategic targets, just places where time had stopped. When the first jeeps appeared at the edge of the cobblestone roads, shutters closed instantly. In many homes, women hid in basements clutching rosaries, uncertain whether the invaders would bring destruction or dignity. The silence before contact was as heavy as the air before a storm. Yet many soldiers carried a surprising empathy. Letters home revealed that countless GIs gave chocolate, cigarettes, and canned rations to starving children. Some even shared meals with families in barns or courtyards once they were sure no danger lingered. They looked more scared of us than we were of them. One private from the 104th Infantry wrote in his diary, "You could see it in their eyes. They thought we'd come to kill them." Still, fear ruled both sides. For every act of kindness, there were moments of suspicion, interrogation, and despair. The American military government struggled to distinguish Nazi loyalists from civilians merely trying to survive. German police were disarmed, mayors removed, and local leaders vetted for collaboration. The process was chaotic, but systematic, the first steps of a nation's reckoning. By April 1945, the U.S. Army had reached the heart of Germany. The thunder of artillery faded, replaced by the rumble of engines entering villages untouched by time. Behind each door waited a population taught to fear their arrival, and soldiers uncertain how to be both conquerors and caretakers. The stage was set for one of the most haunting chapters of the war's end. The human encounter between fear and restraint, between myth and reality, when the Americans finally entered the villages after midnight. When the first American patrols rolled into Germany's rural heartlands, the human reality of the war's ending unfolded in quiet, trembling scenes, far from the triumphal images broadcast back home. In places like Würzburg, Coburg, and countless unnamed villages, war had stripped away everything familiar. The German front line was gone. Authority had dissolved, and for those who remained, the only sound was the echo of approaching engines. Inside the villages, the atmosphere was fragile, like glass under pressure. Families hid in cellars, clutching one another in silence. The ticking of a clock could sound like an explosion. Mothers pressed hands against their children's mouths to stifle a whimper as the first tanks appeared at the end of the street. No one knew what to expect. They had been told the Americans would destroy everything in sight. The human instinct for survival replaced ideology. White sheets, torn from bedding, hung from windows, a desperate signal of surrender. Even those who had once cheered for Hitler now whispered prayers for mercy. The men who remained, too old, too young, or too wounded to fight, waited at the edge of roads, hats in hand. There was no resistance left in them. Many women bore an unbearable fear, not of bullets, but of what would happen after the fighting stopped. They had heard the stories from the East, where Soviet troops exacted brutal vengeance. Goebbels's radio had made no distinction between Russians and Americans. Both, he claimed, were monsters waiting to defile German womanhood. The result was panic so deep that in some regions, families poisoned themselves rather than face what they believed inevitable. But when the Americans finally entered, the reality was different. Not soft, but not the nightmare either. Soldiers shouted orders in English that few understood. Rifles raised but rarely fired. They searched houses for weapons, posted guards, and told civilians to stay inside. The language barrier turned every gesture into a gamble. A movement toward a cupboard might be seen as a threat. A glance at a gun barrel could be mistaken for defiance. Yet, within hours, the chaos settled into an uneasy calm. It was then that propaganda's poison truly surfaced. Years of Nazi lies had dehumanized the enemy so completely that seeing them, real, flesh and blood, shattered the illusion. German women, eyes wide with disbelief, realized the soldiers were human, not the beasts the radio had described. The men in olive drab uniforms looked tired, not bloodthirsty. They carried cigarettes and chocolate, not whips. This transformation, from terror to cautious trust, unfolded in slow, fragile steps. Children, often the first to sense change, became the bridge between both sides. A candy bar offered by a soldier could do what 1,000 speeches could not. It broke the spell of propaganda. A U.S. corporal later recalled, "You could see it. The fear drained away when they saw we didn't hurt them. Just told them to stay put and behave." Still, remnants of Goebbels's machine echoed through the countryside. Some families refused to open their doors for days, convinced that kindness was a trap. Others destroyed Nazi flags and party documents before soldiers could find them. To admit belief in Hitler now was to invite punishment. To deny it too quickly felt like betrayal. Shame hung over everything like smoke after battle. For many civilians, the collapse of the regime created a moral vacuum. They no longer knew whom to trust: the defeated government that had lied to them, or the foreign soldiers now patrolling their streets. "We lived between ghosts," one German woman later said. The Führer was gone, and the enemy had become the only authority. As the days passed, the rhythm of occupation replaced the rhythm of war. American units distributed food, ordered curfews, and sometimes used barns or schools as field quarters. The soldiers' presence was overwhelming but strangely stabilizing. The same tanks that had inspired terror now guarded crossroads to keep looters away. The fear of being killed slowly turned into the fear of what would come next. Yet, beneath the surface, something deeper was shifting. A psychological awakening after years of deception. The propaganda that had painted the Allies as barbarians had also painted Germans as victims of destiny. Now, with the Reich in ruins, that illusion collapsed too. Civilians confronted their own complicity in silence. Some whispered excuses. "We didn't know." Others simply stared at the ground, unable to reconcile guilt with survival. For American soldiers, this transformation was visible in every face they encountered. The villagers looked at them not as victors, but as a mirror, reflecting back the consequences of a regime built on lies. The human angle of this occupation was not glory, but exhaustion. Men and women staring across the same street, both unsure whether to fear or forgive. It was this fragile intersection between fear and understanding that defined the first true contact between occupier and occupied. But while many villages experienced cautious peace, the military reality beneath remained rigid and disciplined. The U.S. Army still had orders to enforce, dangers to control, and a mission larger than emotion. And that discipline, that structure, would shape how mercy and order coexisted in the ruins of Germany. Behind every cautious act of kindness lay the cold machinery of military procedure. The U.S. Army that entered Germany in 1945 was not improvising. It was operating under an immense system of control. Every division advancing eastward carried with it not only tanks and rifles, but also entire civil affairs units trained to govern the defeated. Their task was monumental: to prevent chaos, restore order, and manage millions of civilians whose loyalty was uncertain. Each new village fell into a routine that had been perfected over months of occupation across France and Belgium. First came reconnaissance. Engineers and scouts checked for mines, ambushes, or sniper nests. Then, infantry secured key buildings: the mayor's office, the church tower, the schoolhouse. Within hours, A temporary command post would be established, usually in the largest intact structure. German local officials were summoned, interrogated, and either reinstated under supervision or replaced. The Stars and Stripes was raised, not in celebration, but as a signal. The war here was over. Military discipline remained the spine of this process. Orders forbade looting and abuse, though isolated incidents occurred. The vast majority of soldiers obeyed their codes strictly, knowing that their behavior shaped America's image in the ashes of Europe. Military police patrolled the roads, maintaining curfews and preventing civilians from leaving without permits. The sound of their boots became the new law of the land. Still, control could not erase emotion. For many soldiers, especially those who had lost friends in France or Belgium, restraint demanded superhuman effort. The ruins around them whispered of Nazi aggression. The shattered synagogues, the concentration camps they were beginning to uncover, the graves of Allied airmen shot down and executed by civilians. In those moments, the line between justice and revenge thinned dangerously. Some officers recorded their struggles in blunt reports. Men found it hard to separate the uniform from the ideology. Every German was an enemy until proven otherwise. Others noted remarkable restraint. One colonel wrote, "We came here ready to hate, but what we found were ghosts. They looked more defeated than we could ever make them." The moral angle of this occupation was tangled in contradictions. Soldiers were conquerors, but also witnesses to unimaginable suffering. Civilians were defeated but also complicit. In many towns, American troops discovered labor camps filled with emaciated prisoners. Proof of the horrors civilians had claimed not to know. The question of guilt became unavoidable. Some soldiers forced villagers to walk through nearby camps to confront what their nation had done. Others simply turned away, overwhelmed. This confrontation created one of the war's most haunting moral landscapes. What did victory mean when the victors saw the depth of evil behind it? How could mercy coexist with memory? These questions lingered over every interaction, whether a soldier sharing a meal with a frightened family, or an officer deciding whether to trust a local policeman who had once worn the Nazi armband. Psychologically, the encounters were draining for both sides. American soldiers, accustomed to hostility and camouflage, found it disorienting to enter homes where their enemies looked like their own families. Many were only 19 or 20 years old, barely older than the German boys they captured. "It felt like arresting yourself," one GI wrote. "They had our faces, our ages, our fear." German civilians, meanwhile, were experiencing a collapse of moral gravity. For 12 years, the Reich had told them who to hate, who to fear, and who to obey. Now, those pillars were gone overnight. The silence that followed liberation was not joy, but shock. In diaries recovered after the war, villagers wrote of sleepless nights spent listening to the footsteps of foreign soldiers outside, unsure if they were safe. "We lived in constant waiting," one woman wrote, "waiting for punishment, or maybe forgiveness." Amid that waiting, a strange respect began to grow. The Americans, though stern, were predictable. Their orders were written, their rules consistent. Compared to the terror stories of the East, this felt like salvation. Civilians began to emerge cautiously, offering bread, water, or directions. Some soldiers accepted, others refused. Trust remained fragile, but it was beginning to exist at all. The deeper the Americans moved into Germany, the more psychological distance eroded. Soldiers saw children playing in bombed-out streets. Civilians saw GIs writing letters home under broken lamplight. The humanity neither side expected had returned in fragments. One sergeant noted, "It's strange. After fighting them for years, it feels like we're helping them start over." But beneath this uneasy peace, a different kind of tension simmered. the anticipation of what came next. For all their restraint, the Americans were not finished fighting. The war still raged further south and east. Orders could change at any moment, and each village was only a temporary stop on the road to final victory. Both soldiers and civilians sensed it. The war might be nearly over. But the night was not yet done. As April deepened, the Allied columns moved toward the heart of Bavaria, the Alps, and eventually the end of the Reich itself. Behind them, they left villages caught between ruin and renewal, places where terror had turned into quiet disbelief. And in one such village, just before dawn, the final act of this story would unfold. When the American boots that once echoed down, empty streets would meet the eyes of those who had spent the night praying they would never come. It was April 1945, and the war that had once seemed eternal was now collapsing minute by minute. Across the valleys of Thuringia and the narrow roads of Bavaria, the American columns advanced through the dark like a slow, unstoppable tide. In the villages ahead, fear hung thicker than the smoke from the last shelling. Near the small Bavarian town of Dillingen, the 3rd Infantry Division moved silently through fields glistening with dew. The moon was pale, the engines muffled. Orders were strict: no shooting unless fired upon. Intelligence had warned of scattered SS resistance, but most opposition had already dissolved. The enemy was now confusion itself. Pockets of soldiers without command, civilians without direction, a nation without breath. At 12:07 a.m., the first tank rumbled past the sign marking the edge of the village. Its headlights stayed off. Only the faint red glow of the rear lamp brushed the cobblestones. Behind it, a jeep rolled slowly, its driver scanning doorways through night vision slits. They expected ambush, but none came. Only silence, and then, faintly, a creak of shutters. Someone was watching. Inside the houses, families crouched in basements. A mother whispered prayers as dust trembled from the ceiling with each passing vehicle. "They're here," a voice murmured. In another room, an old man raised his hands toward the heavens, unable to tell whether he was pleading for salvation or forgiveness. In the faint candlelight, the faces were gray with exhaustion. They had lived years under sirens and slogans, but never under the eyes of their enemies. Suddenly, the quiet broke. A door burst open 3 houses down. A young man, barely 16, stumbled into the street waving a white sheet. He shouted something in broken English. "No shoot! No soldier here!" For a heartbeat, the American sergeant froze, finger on the trigger. Then he lowered his rifle and motioned for others to hold fire. That simple gesture, arm raised, palm outward, was the moment fear met discipline. One by one, doors opened. Figures emerged cautiously, hands high. An old woman clutched a Bible. A girl carried a small dog, shaking in her arms. The GIs, eyes scanning every movement, guided them to the side of the road. "Stay there," they ordered, voices firm but calm. One soldier passed around a cigarette, another offered water from his canteen. The villagers didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. The nightmare that propaganda had promised was not happening. Yet not every encounter ended so quietly. In the neighboring town of Meiningen, an SS sniper fired from a church steeple as American troops entered at dawn. The retaliation was swift. A single burst from a Sherman tank, and the steeple collapsed in flames. When the shooting stopped, a squad searched the rubble and found the body of a boy in Hitler Youth uniform, his rifle still clutched in his hands. The villagers watched in silence as his mother screamed beside the ruins. For the soldiers, it was another reminder that the line between combatant and child had vanished long ago. Elsewhere, chaos mingled with compassion. In Thuringia, a column of the 11th Armored Division entered a village near Gotha and discovered hundreds of liberated forced laborers, men and women from Poland, France, and the Soviet Union, wandering the streets, starving and half-mad. German civilians looked on, stunned, as the Americans organized food distribution. A young lieutenant wrote in his notebook. You could see shame on their faces. They knew what had been done in their name. Everywhere, the scenes repeated. Surrender, silence, and the strange birth of peace. The white flags that hung from windows became a new kind of banner. Neither victory nor defeat, but relief. American patrols collected weapons, rounded up stragglers, and posted sentries. The air that had once crackled with fear now felt hollow, like the echo after a storm. In the morning light, soldiers explored streets still marked by swastikas painted on walls. They passed shuttered shops, overturned bicycles, and the smell of bread baking in ovens that no one dared to check. Some GIs found photographs of German families smiling before the war. Weddings, children, birthdays. They realized they were walking through the lives of people who had believed in something that had destroyed them. Among the troops, emotion shifted quietly from tension to reflection. It didn't feel like winning, one corporal later said. It felt like walking through a graveyard that could still breathe. By noon, the village square was under full control. The American flag replaced the Nazi emblem on the town hall. A translator was brought in, and the first formal surrender was recorded. The officer in charge spoke plainly. No more weapons. No more fighting. You will obey our orders. We will not harm you if you follow the rules. The mayor, trembling, nodded repeatedly. Behind him, his people exhaled as if waking from a 12-year nightmare. But beyond that small square, across the fractured heart of Germany, the war still burned. The Red Army was closing in from the east, and the race toward Berlin was reaching its climax. The Americans did not yet know that in just weeks they would uncover the full horror of what the Reich had hidden. For now, all they knew was the sound of boots in quiet streets, and the faint relief of those who had feared them most. The night was over, but the reckoning had just begun. By the second day, the sounds of war had thinned into something unfamiliar. Silence. No artillery thunder, no marching boots, just birdsong, cautious footsteps, and the occasional metallic clatter as soldiers stacked confiscated rifles in village squares. In one corner of Thuringia, Sergeant William Hayes stood before a line of German prisoners. They were farmers, bakers, old men. Few looked capable of fighting. Some wore Wehrmacht tunics without insignia. Others, civilian coats with armbands hastily torn away. Hayes raised a hand for quiet, then spoke through a translator. You're not our enemies anymore. But this war isn't finished. Behave, and you'll live to see it end. The men nodded, eyes downcast, the pride of 1,000 speeches now reduced to dust. A few yards away, a child peeked from behind a doorway, hair matted, face smudged with soot. When she saw the American soldier offer her a chocolate bar, she hesitated, glancing toward her mother for permission. Slowly, she stepped forward and took it. That tiny moment, barely a second, was more powerful than any surrender document. It was the first bridge between conqueror and conquered. Across Bavaria, similar scenes unfolded. In Regensburg, soldiers of the 99th Division entered to find villagers setting out bread and milk by their gates, unsure if the gesture was gratitude or desperation. In one diary, Private Sam Carver wrote, "They're afraid of us. I can see it in their eyes. But when you look closer, it's not hate, it's exhaustion, maybe even relief." The propaganda that had saturated Germany for years was unraveling in real time. Leaflets warning of American beasts meant to kill civilians and destroy homes now felt absurd in the face of soldiers who carried wounded children or shared rations with the hungry. But not all hearts softened. Some U.S. troops, hardened by years of loss and death, could not forgive what they had seen in Belgium or the Ardennes. They looked at every German face and thought of comrades buried under snow. The urge for revenge simmered beneath the discipline. Lieutenant Robert Stein, a Jewish-American officer from New York, entered a small town near Weimar and saw swastikas still hanging from windows. He ordered them torn down. "Not one symbol of that thing stays," he said. When an elderly man protested, "It's history now," Stein replied coldly. "History built this. Let it burn." Later that week, Stein's platoon stumbled upon the Buchenwald concentration camp. His tone changed forever. "After that," he wrote, "I couldn't look at any village the same way. Every brick felt like it had watched something happen. But within that darkness, humanity flickered stubbornly. In a ruined farmhouse near Bamberg, a medic treated a wounded German soldier who had tried to surrender, waving his undershirt. His injury was minor, yet the young man trembled as if awaiting execution. The medic simply said, "You're done fighting. That's enough." For a brief moment, the war's brutality gave way to something raw and human. Two men on opposite sides, both just trying to survive the same nightmare. American chaplains moved through the villages, organizing makeshift services for civilians and troops alike. "Pray for the dead, no matter the uniform," one preacher said, beneath a church whose steeple had been shattered by artillery. The congregation, Germans and Americans together, stood in silence as light filtered through broken glass, illuminating the dust like floating ash. And yet, beneath this fragile calm lay unease. Reports of SS holdouts circulated constantly. In Saxony, a small squad of Americans was ambushed near a bridge by fanatical Hitler youth who refused to surrender. The firefight lasted minutes, but the emotional toll lingered far longer. The realization that boys, some no older than 14, were dying for a regime that had already collapsed, haunted the soldiers who survived. In a letter home, Corporal James Ellison wrote, "We thought we'd feel joy when we won. Instead, it's just quiet. Too quiet. The people look broken. And when I look at them, I don't see enemies. I see what's left when lies run out." As days turned to weeks, the white flags came down, replaced by Allied notices written in both English and German. "Curfew at 8 p.m. No weapons. Cooperation ensures safety." Patrols continued, but hostility faded. Children began to wave shyly at passing jeeps. Bakers reopened ovens. Life, cautious and fragile, began to stir again. Still, shadows remained. Some soldiers wandered the streets of liberated towns and stumbled upon basements filled with Nazi uniforms hastily hidden under blankets, or propaganda posters rolled behind furniture. The symbols had been taken down, but the memories hadn't. Germany was free, but not yet innocent. For many Americans, the moment they entered those silent towns marked the end of their war. For the Germans, it marked the beginning of a long reckoning. Every encounter, a handshake, a meal, a shared silence, became part of an unspoken question. How do you rebuild trust in a world that has seen so much cruelty? As one war correspondent wrote while standing in the ruins of a village square, "Peace did not arrive with fanfare or victory parades. It crept in quietly, barefoot, through the smoke of what used to be a country." The Americans would soon move east toward the rivers of Saxony, where they would meet the Red Army and confront the full extent of the Reich's crimes. But in that fragile window, those few days when guns fell silent and hands reached out across fear, a different kind of battle began. Not for land or power, but for the soul of humanity itself. When the gunfire faded completely, what remained was a silence that felt heavier than war itself. The Americans had entered hundreds of German towns by May 1945, and in each one, the story was the same: confusion, surrender, and a new kind of fear. For the first time in 12 years, The German people were no longer ruled by orders shouted through loudspeakers or printed on red posters. But freedom did not arrive with cheering crowds. It came with curfews, checkpoints, and interrogation rooms. In Bavaria and Thuringia, American units set up temporary military governments. Officers took over schools and town halls, posting signs in both English and German. Obey Allied authority. No weapons. Report former Nazi officials immediately. Civilians lined up outside, holding documents, pleading to prove they had been only farmers or only teachers. Few could admit how deeply the system had touched their lives. The process of denazification began slowly, almost awkwardly. Interrogation teams questioned mayors, policemen, and factory owners. Those with visible Nazi affiliations were removed. Others were kept to maintain order. The Americans knew the fine line between justice and chaos. Destroy the entire administrative class, and nothing would function. Keep them, and the past might return in disguise. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army faced an unexpected challenge: feeding millions of civilians in a country where the infrastructure was destroyed. Roads were cratered, bridges collapsed, rail lines twisted by bombs. Convoys that once carried ammunition now hauled flour and canned food. In some towns, soldiers distributed rations directly to families. German women, still wary, accepted them in silence. Gratitude was often wordless, expressed only through the lowering of eyes or a whispered "Danke." Yet fear still lingered. Fear not of Americans, but of what might come next. Rumors spread quickly. The Red Army was approaching from the east, and their advance brought stories darker than anything the Nazis had warned of. Refugees poured westward by the millions, desperate to reach American lines. They carried nothing but blankets, old papers, and the hollow look of people who had seen too much. To those who had lived under Nazi propaganda, the contrast was staggering. Hitler's speeches had painted Americans as monsters, brutal conquerors who would destroy everything German. Instead, most found a disciplined occupation force that kept order, punished looting, and even rebuilt schools. To a war-torn people, that discipline felt like mercy. In one village near Weimar, an American officer ordered the reopening of a bakery so that bread could be distributed to civilians again. The same ovens that once fed soldiers now baked loaves for children. A local woman later told an Allied reporter, "We were told they would burn everything. Instead, they helped us live." But occupation was not kindness alone. Justice was coming, and it began in whispers. The discovery of concentration camps across central Germany forced the American command to confront the full scale of what had been hidden. When the gates of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen were opened, soldiers who had once viewed Germans as victims now saw complicity. The war had ended, but the moral reckoning had only begun. American reporters wrote dispatches filled with disbelief and fury. Songs. Soldiers patrolled streets lined with ruins and silence. For the first time since 1933, Germany was no longer shouting. It was listening. And as the Americans looked eastward, toward the advancing Soviets, a new unease grew. What kind of peace would follow a war that had divided not only countries, but ideologies? That question, whispered across ruined Europe, would define everything that came next. By summer 1945, Germany was no longer a nation. It was a wound stretching from the Baltic to the Alps. Every major city lay in ruins. Berlin was a hollow carcass, Dresden a sea of ash, Cologne a skeleton of steel and smoke. But in the American zone, Bavaria, Hesse, Württemberg, the ruins were slowly filling with movement again. Trains ran, schools reopened, and life, fragile but defiant, began to stir. Yet under the surface, something more profound was happening. A slow, moral awakening. The interrogations, tribunals, and forced viewings of concentration camps had shattered the illusions built by a decade of propaganda. Civilians who once whispered about rumors now faced the photographs, the uniforms, the skeletal survivors. Some wept, others denied. But no one could look away anymore. Reports from the U.S. military government noted a striking shift in attitude by August 1945. One document read, "Civilians no longer ask when the Führer will return. They ask if they will ever be forgiven." For the American troops, the occupation was a paradox of power and restraint. They had conquered a brutal enemy, and yet their mission was to rebuild it. Soldiers who had stormed beaches now supervised post offices, grain warehouses, and town councils. The same men who once fired rifles now handed out pencils to school children. Many felt uneasy in this role. As one lieutenant wrote home, "We came here to fight Nazis. Now we're teaching them how to write letters again." The comparison with the Red Army was inevitable. In the East, Soviet forces advanced with fury, driven by vengeance for the atrocities committed on their soil. Cities like Königsberg and Breslau fell under brutal retribution, mass deportations, executions, and assaults. Refugees streamed westward in millions, describing what they had seen. To many Germans, the arrival of the Americans no longer felt like defeat. It felt like deliverance. In one testimony from a woman in Saxony, later recorded by Allied reporters, she said, "When we saw the stars on their tanks, we cried, not because we lost, but because we lived." The fear that once defined the final months of the war gradually gave way to a strange sense of relief. American discipline, though firm, was predictable. Orders were clear. Violence was punished. Looting was rare. The contrast with the Red Army's chaos reinforced the image of Americans as reluctant occupiers, conquerors who came to end destruction, not to perpetuate it. But this reputation came with moral weight. As the Nuremberg trials began later that year, the world's gaze turned toward justice. American judges, prosecutors, and journalists chronicled crimes so vast they defied imagination. The camps, the experiments, the massacres. The statistics were almost too heavy to comprehend. Over 50 million dead worldwide, 6 million murdered in the Holocaust, 11 million Germans displaced, and entire cities erased from the map. In the ruins of Frankfurt, a German teacher stood before his students and said quietly, "You were born in a lie. You must grow in truth." It was the first step toward the long, painful reconstruction of a nation's conscience. For many Americans, that transformation became the true victory. Not the surrender documents, not the medals, but the sight of former enemies planting crops again, rebuilding schools, and speaking freely for the first time in years. Official occupation reports by 1946 noted improvements in food distribution, local elections, and infrastructure. But they also emphasized a crucial warning. Democracy must be taught, not imposed. The rebuilding of Germany would take decades, and it would begin not with bricks or flags, but with honesty. By the time the first American divisions prepared to withdraw, the villages that once trembled at midnight had changed. Children ran in the streets again. Farmers plowed bomb-scarred fields. The sound of engines no longer meant invasion, but recovery. The fear that had once defined Germany's nights was slowly replaced by a quieter emotion: remembrance. The people had survived not just the fall of their cities, but the collapse of their own certainty. And as the Americans handed control to local authorities, one officer wrote a final note in his logbook. "We arrived as conquerors. We leave as witnesses." That line would echo far beyond the rubble. Because the true battle, now, was for the memory of what had happened, and for the kind of world that would rise from its ashes. When the last American convoys rolled out of the villages they had once entered under fire, a different kind of silence took hold. It was no longer the silence of fear, but of reckoning. The same streets that had trembled beneath tanks now echoed with footsteps of children walking to rebuilt schools. The same bells that once tolled for air raids now marked the hours of peace. History rarely grants such stark transformations. Enemies had stood face to face at gunpoint, and now they shared tools, bread, and words. The soldiers who had once advanced with caution returned home with stories not of conquest, but of humanity rediscovered amid the ruins. For the German people, the war had stripped away everything: cities, certainty, pride. Yet in that emptiness lay the possibility of rebirth. The silence after midnight, once heavy with dread, became the first breath of a nation learning to listen again. To truth, to memory, to conscience. Where fear had lived, humility took root. Where hatred had ruled, understanding began to grow. In time, the scars faded, but they never disappeared. The burned churches, the cracked stones, and the graves beneath them remained as quiet witnesses, not to the glory of victory, but to the cost of blindness. And from those ashes rose a Germany that no longer sought domination, but dignity. For the Americans, too, the memory endured. They had seen both the depths of cruelty and the fragile spark of mercy that survived it. In the stillness that followed, one truth stood clear: peace is not the absence of war. It is the courage to look upon what war reveals and still choose compassion. The night had ended, the trembling had stopped, and in the silence that followed, the world began again. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel, like it, spread the word, and tell us where you're watching from.